In Venice, 1817, an abandoned theatre reopened its doors. By night, velvet curtains rose, and actors stepped onto the stage. But unlike any theatre before or since, the performances at Teatro Della Notte demanded more than applause. On this stage, every role was fatal. Here, actors bled, choked, and perished before their audiences, and no one ever saw them alive again. What appeared to be theatre was sacrifice, and at the center of it all was one man, Maestro Vittorio Alinari, the director who made death an art form. Tonight, we unearth the forbidden tale of the Venetian theatre where performance and ritual became one, where the line between art and reality dissolved, and where history itself sealed away the records of its final night. This is not myth, nor folklore. This is the story of a stage that swallowed both actors and audience, and of a curse that whispers even now, 2 centuries later. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre record so you never miss another forbidden story lost to time. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? The year was 1817, and Venice was a city both alive and decaying. The power it once held over the seas had long crumbled, its great empire reduced to memory and ruin. Yet its canals still whispered with secrets, its palaces still masked sins behind curtains, and its citizens, starved for spectacle, longed for distraction from decline. By day, merchants moved through narrow alleys, their voices sharp as knives, while nobles drifted in gondolas, wearing masks even when no carnival demanded it. By night, the city belonged to whispers and candlelight, to quiet bargains struck in the dark, and to pleasures pursued in silence. It was a city accustomed to disguises, where truth was always hidden beneath layers of paint and velvet, and in such a place, when a theatre long thought dead reopened, it felt less like coincidence and more like fate. The building itself had slumbered for decades, its wooden doors swollen shut by damp, its windows boarded, its roof sagging under centuries of salt air. Few remembered its name, though older Venetians muttered that shadows had lingered there even before Napoleon's occupation of the city. Yet one night, without fanfare, without proclamation, those doors swung open again. Candles burned in iron lanterns, posters appeared, pasted to crumbling walls in alleys where only the desperate walked. The words were simple: Teatro Della Notte returns. No actors were named, no play was advertised, and no explanation was offered. Only the date, the hour, and the name of the theatre. It was enough to send whispers rippling through the canals. Tickets, when they appeared, were passed by gloved hands in gambling halls and behind taverns, sold for prices that mocked the starving poor. And those who bought them, nobles with decaying fortunes, merchants hoping to impress, priests with quiet sins, spoke with something more than excitement. They spoke with hunger, as if the very mention of the theatre had awakened a need they could not name. Venice, after all, was a city of masks, and the thought of a stage promising secrets and spectacle too dangerous to announce publicly was irresistible. So, on a night in late spring, as fog rolled in from the Adriatic and bells tolled midnight, the curtains of Teatro Della Notte rose once more. No one who entered that night understood what they would witness. No one could have believed that the stage before them was not theatre at all, but an altar. Venice in 1817 was a place where beauty and rot clung to one another so tightly that neither could be separated from the other. By day, the sunlight broke across the lagoon, throwing gold across domes and palaces that still shone with faded grandeur. But beneath the glitter of the surface, poverty festered. The empire was gone, its power dissolved, and those who remained behind the crumbling facades lived in the long shadow of what Venice had once been. Gondoliers ferried nobles who could no longer afford their silks. Merchants sold relics of better times while begging for credit they could not pay back. The canals themselves seemed weary, their waters thick with age, their bridges crumbling under centuries of footsteps. Yet all of this misery only sharpened the appetite for diversion. The city hungered for escape, for something that could make them forget decline, if only for a few hours. Venetians had always lived behind masks. Carnival had once been a season, but in truth it never ended. Even outside the festival, men and women wore disguises, some on their faces, many in their hearts. Lies had become a second language. Respectable merchants found themselves in gambling halls until dawn. Priests whispered sins to each other more eagerly than they heard them in confession. Nobles threw their fortunes into ruin, chasing pleasures they knew they could never afford. Everyone was pretending to be something they were not, and everyone knew it. What was a little more performance, they told themselves, when life itself was already a kind of theatre? It was into this atmosphere that Teatro Della Notte emerged, as if answering an unspoken prayer. A city addicted to spectacle suddenly found itself offered something no other theatre dared promise, something whispered, forbidden, secret. The absence of any advertisement only fueled desire. No titles were announced, no actors' names were spoken. There was only the promise of an experience no one else could give. In taverns by the Rialto, men spoke in lowered voices about tickets changing hands for sums that could buy a man's freedom from debt. In candlelit salons, noblewomen whispered to one another that they had heard the theatre was unlike anything Venice had seen before, that those who attended came away changed, their faces pale but their eyes burning. The more secrecy surrounded it, the more irresistible it became. And there was another detail, whispered though never proven. No posters, no tickets, no invitations bore the name of any living man. There was no manager to meet, no clerk to argue with. Money passed through hands in back rooms, always ending with silence. It was as if the theatre itself had chosen who would enter, plucking its guests from the shadows of the city. When someone asked who had truly reopened the abandoned house, the answer was always the same: Maestro Vittorio Alinari. A name spoken with both awe and unease. A man some claimed was a genius, others a madman, and still others swore had been dead for years. Thus, curiosity sharpened into obsession. Venice in decline found itself magnetized toward the black mouth of a theatre long forgotten, as though the city itself was being pulled by unseen strings. To enter was a choice, but to stay away soon felt impossible. The first accounts of Teatro Della Notte's return came not in newspapers or city proclamations, but in whispers carried across taverns and drawing rooms. No official dared acknowledge it, and yet word spread as if carried by the very canals themselves. A gondolier, half drunk, swore to have seen the lanterns lit and velvet curtains stirring behind cracked windows. A courtesan described noble clients who returned from a performance unable to speak coherently, their words breaking into fragments, their eyes wild with feverish awe. Merchants boasted of paying a fortune for admission, though when pressed, their voices faltered, and they could not explain exactly what they had seen. It was always the same. Those who attended seemed unable, or perhaps unwilling, to speak plainly. Their sentences broke off mid-thought. Their gazes wandered as if still watching something invisible unfold before them. Tickets moved through Venice like contraband. They were never sold openly, only whispered about, passed from gloved hand to gloved hand in candle-lit corners. The price itself became part of the allure. A seat cost what a dock worker might earn in 3 months, what a widow might live on for half a year. And yet the poor pawned their meagre belongings, and the wealthy risked their dwindling estates, all to sit in that darkened hall. The more impossible the ticket became to obtain, the more men and women ruined themselves to find one. A hunger spread, one that no carnival, no masquerade, no gambling hall could match. The authorities looked the other way at first. To them, it was simply another theatre, another distraction for a restless city. Venice had no shortage of sins, and a stage, however strange, seemed harmless compared to the gambling dens and brothels already bleeding the city dry. Yet concern began to stir in hushed tones when familiar faces failed to return. Actors who had been glimpsed entering the theatre were not seen leaving. A young nobleman, known to attend every performance, disappeared after the third night, his family receiving no explanation, no ransom, no trace. Still, no one spoke openly of their unease. Venice had lived too long with secrets to risk exposing one more. Those who managed to glimpse the interior of the theatre before the first performance claimed that something about it was wrong. The air hung heavy, carrying a scent that was not dust nor candle wax, but something closer to iron. The stage seemed to swallow light. Shadows clung unnaturally to the curtains, stretching across the floor like reaching hands. No orchestra played, no chorus rehearsed. Yet those waiting for the curtain to rise described a pressure in the chest, a tightening in the lungs, as if invisible eyes were already watching them. The theatre itself seemed alive, listening, waiting. When the first performance finally arrived, the city leaned forward, breathless. The curtain rose, the actors appeared, and what followed would be spoken of in fragments for generations, though never in the same words. To some it was genius, to others madness. But to all, it was unforgettable. The stage of Teatro Della Notte had awoken, and with it, something darker stirred in Venice. The first performance began as any play might. The audience, restless with curiosity, hushed as the velvet curtains rose. On stage stood men dressed in finery, their costumes echoing the fashions of nobles long dead. The play was simple in its premise, a story of betrayal and honor, of two men bound by friendship who found themselves divided by love. The lines spoken seemed unremarkable at first, even crude compared to the elegance of other Venetian stages. And yet, there was a gravity to the words, as though each syllable carried more weight than its sound should allow. Some spectators swore later that the dialogue did not merely echo from the stage, but vibrated inside their skulls, like a voice heard from within rather than without. The duel came as the natural climax. The two men drew swords, and the crowd leaned forward with delight. Fencing had long been a Venetian pleasure, and to see it dramatized upon the stage was nothing new. Sparks flashed from steel, the actors' blades ringing with skill too precise to dismiss. And then it happened. The first blow struck deep, the sword pierced flesh, and a cry tore from the actor's throat, raw and agonized, not the polished note of rehearsed theatre. He staggered back, clutching his wound, blood spilling across his white costume. The other actor froze, horror painted across his face, and the audience erupted in thunderous applause. They believed it to be a trick, a marvel of new stagecraft, more real than anything they had seen before. They lapped until their hands burned. But the man did not rise. His body crumpled to the boards, convulsed once, and then lay still. The applause faltered, confusion spreading like a murmur through the hall. Some laughed uneasily, convinced the realism was part of the act. Others shifted in their seats, whispering doubts they did not dare voice. The curtain fell too quickly, a ragged descent as stagehands scrambled. When it rose again moments later, the corpse was gone. The story pressed forward as though nothing had occurred. When the audience spilled into the canals after midnight, their voices quivered with excitement. None could agree on what they had seen. Was it illusion? Was it genius? Or had it been real? A few swore the actor had not breathed when dragged into the wings, that his blood had stained the wooden stage-boards. Yet even those who confessed to believing it real also confessed to something darker. They wanted more. The horror of it only sharpened the appetite. In the days that followed, the actor's name was never spoken again. His lodgings were found empty, his belongings abandoned. No grave was dug, no funeral held. It was as though he had never existed. And when the next performance was announced, the crowd doubled. Venice had always been a city that thrived on spectacle, but never before had it applauded death so eagerly. In the days after the first performance, one name passed more frequently through Venetian lips than any other: Maestro Vittorio Alinari. To most, he was little more than a rumour, a figure glimpsed in shadows at the edge of the stage, his presence whispered rather than confirmed. Yet everyone seemed to know of him, even those who swore they had never seen his face. Some claimed he had once directed operas in Florence, a prodigy whose vision was said to border on madness. Others insisted he had been banished from Milan for staging works that blurred the line between theatre and blasphemy. And still others swore he had died decades earlier, that what stood behind the curtains of Teatro Della Notte was not a man at all, but something wearing the skin of one. What little could be confirmed was troubling enough. Alinari's early productions, before his disappearance from polite society, had always carried whispers of scandal. Actors under his direction reported being pushed beyond the limits of sanity, forced to rehearse until their voices broke and their minds began to fray. His scripts, often adapted from obscure texts, were filled with strange instructions and symbols that had no place in ordinary theatre. Stagehands recalled rituals performed before rehearsals, candles lit, phrases in languages they could not recognize, and Alinari's voice rising above all, commanding rather than directing. When he vanished from Florence in the late 1790s, rumours filled the void. Some said he had fled to escape charges of obscenity. Others claimed he had been imprisoned for dealings with societies forbidden by the Church. A few whispered that he had drowned in the Arno, his body swallowed by the river. Yet no record of his death was ever found, and when Teatro Della Notte reopened in Venice, his name returned as if it had been waiting, dormant, ready to reattach itself to the stage. Those who described him, though accounts vary, spoke of a tall figure, cloaked always in black, with a presence that bent rooms around him. His hair, streaked silver, framed a face that seemed carved from marble, pale and unyielding. His eyes, said one survivor, were like the stage itself, too dark, too deep, swallowing light. He rarely spoke in public, yet when he did, his words seemed to weigh more than their sound. They did not persuade, they compelled. Actors who worked under him claimed they could not disobey, even when their souls urged them to flee. Venetians, of course, made stories to fill the gaps. They said he had studied with monks who guarded forbidden manuscripts, that he had travelled to plague pits to collect bones for his research, that he had walked away from his own funeral and left mourners staring at an empty coffin. No two accounts aligned, but all agreed on one truth. Maestro Vittorio Alinari had returned, and with him came a theatre that asked more of its actors than performance. It asked for their very lives. The actors of Teatro Della Notte were not household names. They were not the celebrated performers of Venice's grander halls or the renowned opera stages that still clung to their reputations. They were young, ambitious, and desperate. Some were orphans of war, others failed apprentices of more respectable companies, still others cast-offs with no patrons left to sponsor them. For such souls, Alinari's invitation was irresistible. He promised them not just work, but immortality. Their names, he told them, would never be forgotten. They would become part of a theatre that defied time itself. To men and women who had nothing, such words felt like salvation. They did not yet know they were signing away their last shreds of self. What survives of them now comes not from playbills or biographies, but from fragments, letters to family, diaries abandoned in rented rooms, testimonies gathered from neighbours who swore they heard screams echoing late into the night. These documents reveal a pattern, one that grew darker with every performance. At first, their writing was filled with excitement. One young actress wrote to her sister in Padua that she had never felt more alive, that rehearsals seemed to stir something inside her she had never known existed. Another actor described how the maestro's presence gave him a strength he could not explain, that words which once stumbled on his tongue now flowed effortlessly, as if he had always known them. They spoke of exhaustion, yes, but also of exhilaration. They believed they were part of something larger than themselves. Yet within weeks, their tone changed. The same actress who had written of joy now confessed she was waking at night reciting lines in a voice not her own. She begged her sister to come to Venice, claiming she could not remember which parts of her thoughts belonged to her and which belonged to the character she was rehearsing. One actor complained in his journal that when he tried to improvise or alter a line, his body refused. His lips locked, his throat seized, and the words came out exactly as written. He feared the script itself had power over him. Another reported staring into a mirror and seeing his reflection mouth words he had not spoken. Neighbors who lived near the theatre grew uneasy. They spoke of the young performers wandering the streets at dawn, pale and wide-eyed, muttering passages as though in a trance. They said the actors no longer seemed to belong to themselves. A washerwoman claimed that one young man, once cheerful and kind, had stood outside her window for an hour, whispering lines about betrayal, his face blank, his eyes unblinking. When she shouted at him, he fled without a word. None of them knew what to make of it, but all agreed that the actors were changing. They were becoming shadows of the roles they played. And always behind it all was Alinari, watching, guiding, demanding. He did not need to shout or threaten. The actors followed him as if bound by invisible chains, as if the moment they set foot upon his stage, they ceased to be their own. The scripts of Teatro Della Notte were unlike any others of their age. Ordinary playbills listed titles, acts and dialogue in neat columns, their margins filled with cues for lighting, music or entrances. But Alinari's pages were different. They were heavy, written on thick parchment that seemed older than the ink upon it. Some claimed the paper bore watermarks not of Venetian mills, but of origins long forgotten, as though the pages had been salvaged from libraries no longer standing. The handwriting itself was unsettling. Sharp, angular strokes that carried an elegance, but also a severity, as though each letter had been carved rather than written. Actors who read them confessed to strange sensations. Several spoke of an unease that crept into their bones as they traced the lines, as if their eyes were not simply absorbing words, but allowing something to enter them. One young man swore that when he turned a page, he felt a pulse beneath his fingers, as though the parchment itself throbbed faintly with life. Another admitted that she could not read the words aloud without her voice quivering, no matter how often she rehearsed. There were phrases that twisted the tongue, sounds that seemed less like language and more like incantations. Even those who heard the words spoken described chills running through them, though they could not explain why. The stage directions were stranger still. Instead of simple commands like exit left or draw sword, the margins often carried instructions more fitting for a ritual than a performance. The actor must bleed upon the final line. The actress must not resist the blade, but embrace it. The audience must remain silent for 13 breaths. Such notes blurred the line between drama and ceremony. Stagehands swore they saw Alinari pore over these directions with greater intensity than the dialogue itself, whispering them under his brow, as though testing their weight. It became clear that the plays had no authorship beyond Alinari, and yet many suspected even he was not their origin. The archaic turns of phrase, the references to long-dead kings, the invocations of symbols known only to scholars of the occult, these did not feel like the work of one man. Some whispered that the scripts had been unearthed rather than written, recovered from plague pits or monasteries, perhaps even from the catacombs of forgotten cities. Wherever they came from, the actors were compelled to follow them with unwavering precision. They found themselves unable to improvise, unable even to pause without an unbearable pressure tightening in their throats. The words had to be spoken exactly as written, as though each line was a command that could not be defied. And the audience, though unaware of the pages themselves, felt their influence too. Listeners reported that the dialogue seemed to sink into their skin, leaving fragments of lines echoing in their minds for days afterward. They could not forget what they heard, no matter how much they wished to. The scripts did not simply tell a story. They bound those who encountered them, actors and audience alike, into something larger, something darker that could not be undone. The second performance drew an even greater crowd than the first. Word of the duel had spread, and though no one could confirm whether the actor's death had been genuine, the possibility itself was enough to set Venice ablaze with curiosity. Nobles sold jewels, merchants emptied their purses, even priests disguised in plain cloaks slipped through the canals, all for a seat within the theatre's walls. By the time the lanterns burned outside Teatro Della Notte, the line of gondolas stretched like a procession of shadows across the water. Those who entered did so with a mixture of dread and anticipation, their hearts pounding faster than the bells of San Marco. The play that night was a story of jealousy, of a husband driven mad by suspicion. It unfolded slowly, with long silences that made the hall grow tense. The actors moved with a precision that seemed unnatural, as if their bodies were guided by strings pulled from above. Every gesture was deliberate, every word spoken with a weight that pressed down on the room. The audience leaned forward, unable to look away, their breath caught in the pauses between lines. It was not theatre in the way they had known it. It was something else, something ritualistic, almost liturgical. The climax arrived in the form of a confrontation between husband and wife. She denied the accusations, her voice breaking with desperate conviction. He loomed over her, his hands trembling as if torn between rage and restraint. The audience, expecting a staged quarrel, sat poised for the illusion of violence, but what they witnessed shattered the boundary between art and reality. The husband's hands closed around the woman's throat, and her scream echoed through the theatre with such raw terror that several spectators rose from their seats. Her body writhed, heels scraping against the stage, fingers clawing at his arms. Her face darkened, her eyes bulged, and her voice broke into a choked gurgle. Still, the actor did not release her. Some in the crowd clapped nervously, believing it to be part of the act. Others gasped and tried to rise, only to find themselves transfixed, their muscles refusing to move. When at last her body went limp and the hands slipped away, the silence that followed was suffocating. The actress lay sprawled across the floor, her head at an unnatural angle, her chest unmoving. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the curtain dropped with a sudden finality, and when it rose again, she was gone. The play continued, but the audience no longer heard the words. Their minds were still fixed on the image of her lifeless body, her final breath rattling in their ears. When the performance ended, the theatre released its guests back into the Venetian night. Some staggered as though drunk, others whispered prayers, but all agreed they had witnessed something extraordinary. None could say for certain whether the death had been real or performed, yet few truly doubted. And the most disturbing truth of all was this. Despite their horror, many found themselves eager for the next performance. Fear and fascination had become indistinguishable. By the time the second performance ended, Venice itself seemed to have fallen under a spell. Conversations in taverns, in markets, and even in the hushed corners of churches returned again and again to the same subject. Those who had been inside the theatre spoke of it with a fervour that bordered on madness. Their eyes gleamed when they described the stage, their voices trembling not with fear, but with longing. They spoke of realism so perfect it erased all doubt, of emotion so raw they felt carved into the bone. Yet when pressed for detail, their words collapsed into fragments, as though the memory itself resisted being spoken. They would begin to describe a moment only to fall silent, their mouths open, but their voices stilled. The upper classes were the most entranced. Nobles who had once prided themselves on patronizing the grand opera houses now boasted of their attendance at Alinari's hidden theatre. Invitations to salons and feasts carried more weight if one could whisper that they had witnessed the performances firsthand. Women wore black ribbons around their necks as a secret sign to others that they had seen the strangling scene. Men carved the letters TDN into their walking sticks, as though marking themselves part of an exclusive order. Even the clergy, outwardly condemning the theatre, were rumoured to slip in through back entrances, faces covered, desperate to see what was forbidden. For the common folk, the theatre became an obsession of rumour. They could not afford the tickets, but they haunted the canals outside its doors, waiting for nobles to emerge so they might hear a snatch of description, a half-spoken detail. They crowded taverns to overhear those wealthy enough to attend. Some even claimed they could hear echoes of the performances carried over the water, voices whispering in the night when the curtains rose. Whether real or imagined, it only deepened their hunger. And yet beneath the fascination, a darker current stirred. Families of missing actors began to speak quietly of their sons and daughters who had vanished. A mother swore she had seen her daughter enter the theatre but never return. A landlord reported that one of his tenants had left all his belongings untouched, as though he had been taken in the middle of life itself. When questions were asked, no answers came. The names of the missing were never spoken from the stage, never printed on any notice. It was as if they had been swallowed whole by the theatre. Still, this did not cool the city's obsession. If anything, the whispers of danger only sharpened the desire. Venice had always been drawn to spectacle, and what greater spectacle could there be than the possibility of true death performed before their very eyes? To those who returned again and again, it no longer mattered whether the deaths were real or staged. What mattered was the feeling that no other theatre could give, the sense that they were witnessing something sacred, something terrible, something meant never to be spoken aloud, yet impossible to forget. The actors of Teatro Della Notte began to vanish not only upon the stage, but in their ordinary lives. At first, their absences were explained away as coincidence. One had left the city suddenly, it was said, called home by an ailing mother. Another had secured employment with a travelling troupe and departed without time for farewells. But those who lived near the theatre, who knew the voices of these men and women, told a different story. They spoke of screams echoing through the shuttered windows late at night, cries that rose above the canals and then fell silent as quickly as they began. They told of seeing shadows moving in the upper galleries when no performance was scheduled, shapes writhing as though in agony. And always, when daylight returned, another actor was gone. Boarding houses were left with rooms where belongings lay untouched, dresses folded neatly, letters unsent, shoes by the bed as if waiting to be worn again. The tenants had vanished between one breath and the next, leaving no explanation, no trail. Families travelled from the mainland to search, knocking on doors, pleading with authorities, but their efforts met only silence. The city, it seemed, had agreed to turn its face away. Venice had survived centuries by ignoring what it did not wish to see. To acknowledge the disappearances would be to acknowledge the possibility that the theatre consumed not just lives, but souls. Those who lingered in the vicinity of the theatre told of other strange happenings. A gondolier swore he had seen a young man dragged through a side entrance by two figures cloaked in black, his feet leaving streaks upon the stone. A washerwoman passing by at dawn claimed she heard voices chanting inside, low and guttural, words she could not understand. When she returned the next day, the building stood silent, its doors sealed as though it had never stirred at all. Others ribbed seeing figures at the windows, actors whose faces they recognized, gazing down with vacant eyes that followed them through the mist. The survivors among the troupe grew fewer, and those who remained seemed to deteriorate before the city's eyes. They walked the streets like sleepwalkers, their lips moving silently, as if rehearsing lines that no one else could hear. They no longer spoke their own names, answering only to the roles they had been assigned. One man introduced himself not as Giovanni, but as the betrayer. Another woman, when asked by a neighbour if she was well, replied simply, "The script has no need of me today." These fragments, repeated and retold, spread through Venice like sickness. And yet, despite all this, the theatre's audience only grew. For every actor who disappeared, for every whisper of screams in the night, the fascination intensified. To those who bought tickets, the risk only heightened the allure. They no longer saw the performers as people, but as vessels, sacrifices upon an altar that demanded more each night. What mattered was not who vanished, but what spectacle awaited the next curtain's rise. The remaining actors of Teatro Della Notte began to speak in ways that unsettled even those accustomed to the city's madness. They complained not only of exhaustion, but of intrusions into their very thoughts. One diary, later discovered beneath a rotting floorboard, described the sensation of being inhabited. The writer explained that when rehearsing lines, he no longer felt the words forming from his own mind. Instead, they arrived fully shaped, pressing against his lips until he spoke them aloud. He feared that if he refused, the pressure would crush his skull. Another account, found in the margins of a prayer book, revealed a woman's terror at seeing her reflection move differently from her body, as though the mirror had trapped a version of herself that was no longer hers to command. She wrote of watching her reflection mouth words she had not spoken, smiling when her own face was still. Neighbors confirmed these fears. One insisted he had seen an actor pacing the corridor of his lodgings, rehearsing lines in the dead of night. Yet when he listened more closely, he realized the man was silent. His lips moved, his throat worked, but no sound escaped. Still, the lines echoed faintly in the air, as though whispered by a second voice, invisible but present. Others swore they saw actors speaking to empty rooms, nodding as though receiving instructions from someone unseen. No matter how many times they crossed themselves or muttered prayers, the unease only deepened. Some actors confessed they no longer remembered their lives before the stage. A young man who once painted portraits abandoned his brushes, claiming his hands refused to obey unless they held a prop dagger. A woman who had come to Venice seeking fortune as a singer lost her voice entirely, except when reciting her character's lines. It was as if the roles themselves were burrowing into their identities, hollowing out the people who had once worn them. Even when not in costume, they moved with gestures belonging to the stage. Their laughter sounded rehearsed, their tears seemed forced, until the boundaries between character and self dissolved completely. And always, the scripts were there, looming like silent masters. Several actors spoke of pages that seemed to change between readings, as though the words rewrote themselves to tighten their grip. One man claimed he had burned his copy in desperation, only to find it returned the next morning upon his desk, the ash gone as though it had never been. Another swore he had never memorized his lines, yet when he stepped upon the stage, they spilled from his mouth perfectly, each word exact, as if carved into his tongue. Those who lived near the theatre whispered that the building itself magnified the madness. They heard voices carried through the walls, even on nights when no performance was scheduled. Sometimes it was laughter, sometimes weeping, but often it was chanting, low and inhuman, a chorus that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. And though the city outside bustled as it always had, inside those walls, reality itself bent to the will of scripts that no living hand should have written. The audience of Teatro Della Notte was no longer composed of casual theatre-goers seeking a night's amusement. Those who attended spoke afterward with the fervour of worshippers leaving a temple. They admitted, sometimes in whispers, that something was terribly wrong within those walls. The deaths looked too real, the actors vanished too completely. The air itself seemed to press against their skin like a hand. And yet, instead of recoiling, they returned again and again, drawn as if by invisible threads. Even those who swore they would never step inside again found themselves drifting back when the lanterns lit and the velvet curtains swayed in the mist. It was not curiosity alone that pulled them, but hunger, a need that grew sharper with each performance, impossible to ignore. Many described the sensation of being held captive during the plays. They said their bodies refused to move, that even when horror unfolded before their eyes, their limbs remained heavy, their hands locked in place. Some tried to avert their gaze during the climaxes, but their heads would not turn, their eyes fixed wide until the curtain fell. A few whispered that they felt something feeding upon them, drawing strength from their silence, their stillness, their attention. And when the play ended, instead of relief, they were left trembling with desire to see more. The addiction spread through the city like fever. Families who had once condemned the theatre now begged for tickets. Nobles bankrupted themselves, pawning heirlooms for one more seat in the gilded boxes. Priests delivered fiery sermons by day, only to slip into the audience by night, their faces shadowed by hoods. And the more the fear grew, the greater the attendance became. The very danger of it, the sense that each performance risked their sanity or their souls, seemed only to deepen their obsession. Venice had always thrived on spectacle, but this was different. This was devotion, a cult not of faith but of art and blood. What unsettled survivors most was not the deaths on stage, but the way they themselves responded to them. More than one confessed that when an actor fell, when blood stained the boards, they felt a rush of exhilaration so strong it shamed them. They applauded without meaning to, their hands striking together until their palms bruised, even as their stomachs turned. They knew they should recoil. Instead, they begged for more. They became not witnesses to horror, but accomplices. A letter discovered years later, written by a Venetian merchant to his brother, described the sensation with unsettling clarity. I knew what I saw was no illusion. The woman's eyes bulged, her tongue swelled, her body collapsed without breath. And yet I clapped. I clapped until my hands bled. I am sickened by myself, but I will go again. I cannot resist. The theatre calls me. Such confessions reveal the truth. Teatro Della Notte was not merely killing actors. It was corrupting its audience, binding them as surely as the scripts bound the performers, until the entire city shared in the sin. The third performance was the one that cemented Teatro Della Notte's reputation, not only as the most dangerous stage in Venice, but as something altogether inhuman. On that night, the theatre was more crowded than ever before. Gondolas pressed against each other along the canals outside, their lanterns swaying like restless stars. Inside, the air was feverish. Nobles leaned over balconies, merchants wiped sweat from their brows, priests crossed themselves with trembling fingers. All of them had come because the whispers promised that this night would be unlike any other. The play began as many tragedies do, with betrayal and vengeance. The actors spoke their lines in voices that resonated unnaturally in the chest, every word carrying weight beyond its meaning. The audience leaned forward, held in silence as the story twisted toward its inevitable end. And then the final act arrived. The condemned was led upon the stage, his hands bound, his head bowed. A great axe was carried in by another actor, dressed not as an executioner, but as a priest, his robes black, embroidered with symbols that none in the audience recognized. The condemned fell to his knees. His final words trembled through the theatre, not cries for mercy, but lines spoken with solemn resignation. He thanked the audience for bearing witness, then lowered his head upon the block. The executioner priest raised the axe high above him, and in that suspended moment the audience realized with horror and certainty that what they were about to see was no illusion. The blade fell. The sound was not theatrical. It was the sound of bone splintering, of sinew tearing, of blood erupting into the air. The severed head rolled across the stage, eyes still open, mouth still twitching, as if trying to speak one final line. Gasps tore through the audience, but almost at once those gasps gave way to applause. Men and women lapped as blood sprayed, their cries of horror tangled with cheers until the theatre thundered with approval. Some fainted, others retched, but none left their seats. They were bound to witness it all. When the curtain dropped, the stagehands moved swiftly, carrying away the body as though it were little more than a discarded prop. The play ended without epilogue, without explanation. And when the audience poured out into the night, their faces pale and eyes wide, they spoke not of outrage, but of awe. Some claimed it was the most brilliant piece of theatre they had ever seen. Others whispered that Alinari had transcended the very art form, transforming performance into a communion with death itself. The actor who died that night was never seen again. His lodgings were emptied, his name stricken from the lips of those who once knew him. No funeral, no mourning, no grave. The city pretended he had never existed. And yet, for those who sat in the theatre, his death became immortal. They carried it with them, unable to erase the image of his head tumbling across the stage, his final expression etched forever in their minds. By the time the third performance ended, whispers had grown too loud to ignore. The city authorities, already aware of the disappearances and the growing unrest among the families of missing actors, could no longer feign ignorance. Officials were pressed by noble houses demanding explanations, and by clerics uneasy with the mounting rumors of blasphemy. Venice, for all its tolerance of sin, understood the danger of scandal too great to contain. The Doge's envoys were sent quietly to inquire about Teatro Della Notte, but what they found only deepened the unease. The theatre had no records. No contracts bound actors to the company. No leases named an owner for the building. No tax receipts accounted for the immense sums passing through its doors. The ledgers that should have existed were either missing or had never been written. It was as though the theatre did not exist in the city's eyes, even while its lanterns burned every night. Officials who attempted to enter without tickets reported a suffocating heaviness at the doors, a sensation like pushing against invisible stone. Some swore they heard whispers, warning them to turn back. None could bring themselves to force entry. Still, a few bolder voices demanded the place be shut down. One magistrate declared it an affront to God, a theatre that defiled the very concept of art by staining it with blood. He announced an investigation, threatening to drag Alinari himself before the council. Days later, his body was found floating in a canal, throat slit, eyes wide with terror. No culprit was ever named. After that, those in power chose their words more carefully. The truth was that many among the ruling elite were already entangled. Nobles with influence had attended the performances, their hunger for spectacle outweighing their sense of duty. Several councillors were whispered to speak lines from the plays in their sleep, as though the scripts themselves had followed them home. Others found themselves unable to condemn Alinari, because to do so would be to condemn their own participation. And so, official inquiries were stalled, silenced, or conveniently forgotten. The church, too, hesitated. Priests thundered against the theatre from their pulpits, warning their flocks of damnation, yet the confessional boxes told a different story. Parishioners whispered of attending, of feeling compelled, of fearing what they had seen, and yet longing for more. Some priests themselves admitted to watching, unable to resist. Their sermons grew hollow, their authority fractured. How could they condemn a theatre when their own souls had been marked by its performances? Venice was left in a paralysis of complicity. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one acted. The city's authorities, bound by greed and fear, turned their faces away. The church, corrupted by its own fascination, dared not confront what it could not defeat. And so Teatro Della Notte continued to operate freely, its doors opening night after night, its stage demanding more blood with every performance. Venice had become not just a city of witnesses, but a city of accomplices. Whispers about Maestro Alinari's scripts spread faster than the plays themselves. Though few had ever touched the pages, rumors clung to them like mildew to stone. Some said they were not written in Venice at all, but unearthed from plague pits, where priests had buried both the dead and the texts they carried with them. Others insisted the parchment had come from abandoned monasteries, hidden deep in the Alps, where monks had long ago transcribed books of rituals not meant for mortal eyes. A few even claimed Alinari had travelled to the Ottoman Empire, returning with scrolls of forgotten languages that scholars dared not translate. Whatever their origin, the stories agreed on one thing: the words did not belong to the present age. Stagehands who glimpsed the scripts during rehearsals spoke of symbols drawn in the margins, shapes that shifted when studied too long, curves that seemed to writhe like worms across the parchment. They described diagrams of circles and markings that resembled both geometry and scripture, though neither fully explained them. Some workers swore they saw stains on the pages, dark blotches like dried blood, though Alinari forbade anyone to speak of it. Those who did not obey were dismissed, their names never again spoken within the theatre. The actors, when asked about their lines, offered little comfort. They said the scripts never read the same twice. A passage rehearsed in the morning would appear altered by night, the words rearranged, as if the play rewrote itself while left unattended. One actress confessed that she tried to copy her lines into a private notebook, only to find that when she returned the next day, her handwriting had changed. The words no longer matched what was on Alinari's page, and her own version became unreadable, the letters dissolving into scrawls like the fevered scribbles of a madman. Another performer described the sensation of being read rather than reading, as though the text studied him as he turned its pages, measuring, selecting, binding him more tightly to the role. Scholars who later heard of these accounts suggested the plays may have drawn from grimoires, books of forbidden rites that surfaced from time to time in Europe's black markets. Venice, a city built on trade, had always been a crossroads for such things, where relics of plague, war, and conquest washed ashore alongside silk and spice. But the specificity of the scripts, the way they mirrored the deaths enacted upon the stage, suggested something deeper than superstition. These were not stories written for entertainment. They were instructions, rituals disguised as theatre, each line a binding, each stage direction a sacrifice. Alinari himself never claimed authorship. When asked, he would only smile faintly and say that the words came from a tradition older than any living memory. Some believed he had stumbled upon them by chance, a cursed inheritance passed into his hands. Others suspected he had sought them deliberately, giving himself over to forces beyond comprehension. Whatever the truth, the scripts became the heart of Teatro Della Notte. They were not plays to be performed. They were ceremonies to be completed, and each performance drew Venice deeper into their grasp. The fourth performance was the one that broke even the strongest illusions of theatre. Until then, some clung to the belief that the deaths were elaborate trickery, some dark genius of stagecraft that made reality indistinguishable from art. But when children appeared upon the stage, that fragile defense collapsed. The tickets for that night were more coveted than ever before. Nobles paid sums that could have purchased entire gondolas, and commoners sold heirlooms handed down for generations. The city swelled with a fever that made reason impossible. All who could afford a seat crammed into the theatre's suffocating darkness, whispering among themselves with a hunger that bordered on madness. The play began with innocence, a family drama that seemed almost ordinary at first. A mother rocked a child in her arms, while others played nearby, their laughter ringing through the hall. The audience gasped, not at the acting, but at the unmistakable youth of the performers. These were no small-bodied adults disguised by costume. These were children, their voices unbroken, their movements clumsy and untrained. Their presence unsettled the crowd even before the story darkened. Venice had always known cruelty, but it had not expected to see it dressed in such fragile forms. The tale grew grim as accusations rose, the father condemning his children for imagined sins. His words cracked like thunder, and the children shrank beneath his rage. The audience, shifting uneasily, waited for the resolution of ordinary drama, for reconciliation or exile. But no such mercy came. The climax descended swiftly. The father's hand closed around a child's throat. Another was struck with a blade. A third fell writhing across the stage boards, their cries piercing in their authenticity. The audience erupted, some screaming, some gasping, some applauding against their own will. A few fainted, yet still the curtain did not fall. The deaths continued in sequence, ritualistic in their precision. One child's breath was cut short in silence, another's lifeblood pooled across the floor. The final lay still, eyes wide and unblinking. The crowd, transfixed, could not move. Many later confessed that they prayed desperately for it to be illusion, for the children to rise with bows at the end. But when the curtain finally dropped and rose again, the small bodies were gone, erased as if they had never been. The play marched forward, indifferent, demanding its lines be spoken to completion. When the performance ended, the silence outside was heavier than the applause within. The audience staggered through the mist as though waking from a nightmare, their faces pale, their voices hushed. Yet even in their horror many whispered of returning. Some swore the children had been orphans, nameless and forgotten, chosen precisely so none would question their disappearance. Others argued they had been conjured, not born. Whatever the truth, the effect was undeniable. The theatre was no longer seen as a stage. It was now an altar, one that had claimed the most innocent of sacrifices. Few who entered the service of Teatro Della Notte survived long enough to speak afterward, but the fragments that did escape reveal a nightmare behind the curtain. These testimonies did not come from stars of the stage, for there were none. They came from bit players, those cast in minor roles, dismissed or fled before the theatre consumed them entirely. Their words, scattered through journals, letters, and whispered recollections, paint a picture more dreadful than the performances themselves. One young man, whose account was later found scribbled in the margins of a discarded playbill, described rehearsals that bore little resemblance to theatre. The actors did not practice lines in the ordinary sense. Instead, they were made to repeat phrases while standing within chalk circles scrawled across the stage floor. The maestro himself would pace around them, murmuring in a language none recognized, his voice rising and falling like a chant. Whenever a performer stumbled over a line, Alinari would stop abruptly and place a hand upon their shoulder. The actor would convulse, choking as though the words themselves were forced from their lungs until they repeated the line flawlessly. Another account, written shakily in a diary that ended mid-sentence, described the sensation of being watched during rehearsal, not by Alinari, but by figures cloaked in black who stood silently in the wings. They did not speak, did not move, but their presence radiated a cold so bitter that the actress's breath misted in the air, even in the warmth of the candles. When she asked who they were, the maestro dismissed the question with a smile, insisting that every performance required an audience, even in practice. She never wrote again after that entry. One testimony came from a stagehand who fled after only 2 nights of work. He claimed that during rehearsal, the scripts gave off a sound, a fail, and hum, like bees trapped in a jar. When the actors spoke their lines, the hum grew louder, until the very boards of the stage vibrated beneath their feet. He swore that beneath the stage, hidden chambers existed, and that from within those chambers, voices responded to the lines above, echoing faintly, as though the dead themselves repeated the play. His story was dismissed as madness, yet his disappearance weeks later lent it a terrible weight. What united all these fragments was a single truth. Rehearsal was not practice, but initiation. Each session stripped the actors of themselves, binding them tighter to the roles until they no longer distinguished performance from life. Those who resisted were not scolded or dismissed. They were silenced. Their names vanished from bills, their belongings removed from lodgings. Their existence erased, as if the theatre itself had swallowed them. The survivors who spoke did so with voices trembling, their eyes darting as if afraid of unseen watchers. They begged not to be named, not to be recorded, for they believed the scripts remembered them still. To them, escape was only temporary. Once chosen by Alinari, they insisted, one never truly left the theatre. The role waited, eternal, ready to claim them again. The building that housed Teatro Della Notte had always been a curiosity, even before its reawakening. Its origins were lost to memory, its construction unrecorded in any of the city's archives. Some claimed it had stood since the Renaissance, Others swore it was older still, a relic raised upon foundations laid before Venice itself was born from the marshes. Whatever its age, those who entered spoke of a structure that did not obey the logic of ordinary architecture. The facade was unremarkable, little more than a crumbling stone front with narrow windows sealed by rot. But once inside, the space seemed to shift. Corridors stretched longer than they appeared from the outside, staircases twisted in spirals that returned to places they had never led before, and rooms appeared or vanished depending on the hour of night. Visitors described shadows that moved against the direction of the candles, stretching in unnatural lengths across the walls, sometimes pausing as though listening before creeping back into corners. Even in silence, the theatre seemed to breathe. The wooden boards creaked with no weight upon them, and draughts of air whispered through the rafters without cause. Patrons sitting in their seats before the curtain rose reported feeling as if someone were directly behind them, leaning close enough that a breath tickled their neck. Yet when they turned, the rows were empty. Stagehands told stories of trapdoors that opened onto stairwells no one had built, leading to chambers lined with stone far older than the theatre itself. Some claimed the theatre's foundations extended into catacombs, tunnels that honeycombed beneath Venice, connecting to places no map recorded. A few even swore they heard water far below, lapping not like the familiar canals, but like waves against cavern walls, as though the theatre stood above a hidden sea. The stage itself possessed its own peculiarities. The boards were darker than ordinary wood, and no matter how much blood spilled upon them, they never stained. The surface seemed to drink it, leaving the wood smooth and clean by the next performance. Actors swore the floor was warm beneath their feet, as though pulsing faintly with a heartbeat. Musicians who attempted to play within the hall reported that their instruments fell out of tune, strings snapping without cause, notes dissolving into discordant echoes. Most unsettling of all was the balcony above the stage. Though it appeared empty, some audience members reported glimpsing pale faces watching from the shadows, their features indistinct, their eyes luminous. When asked, Alinari dismissed them as imagination. Yet multiple witnesses described the same vision, rows of silent watchers who never moved, never applauded, and vanished when the lamps were lit. The theatre was no longer just a place. It was an entity, shaping itself around those who entered. Walls shifted, shadows listened, and the very air thickened with anticipation, as though the building itself yearned for the curtain to rise. To step inside Teatro Della Notte was not to visit a performance hall. It was to enter the belly of something alive, ancient, and starving. By the summer of 1817, Venice was no longer united in its whispers about Teatro Della Notte. The city had become split between those who worshipped the theatre as the pinnacle of art and those who whispered that it was a curse upon the lagoon. The faithful returned again and again, each night emerging pale and trembling, but with eyes alight, insisting that Alinari had elevated theatre into something divine. They spoke of the performances as revelations, experiences too sacred to describe, and when challenged, they grew defensive, even violent. Some claimed that those who condemned the theatre simply had not seen it, and if they had, they too would understand. These voices grew louder with every performance, until devotion to Alinari's stage became its own form of cult. But there were others, the grieving families of actors who had vanished, the neighbors who heard screams through the theatre's walls, the priests who confessed in private that they had glimpsed blasphemy too terrible to name. They whispered that the plays were not art but rituals, sacrifices masked as entertainment, and that Venice had allowed itself to become complicit in feeding a hunger not of this world. Their warnings, however, were drowned beneath the roar of fascination. For every voice that spoke against the theatre, 3 more rose in its defense, drunk on the thrill of having seen what no other city could claim. Even those who despised what unfolded on the stage found themselves unable to act. Venice had always thrived on secrecy, on the unspoken pact that sins would be hidden so long as the city could continue its masquerade. And so, once again, silence became the city's shield. Officials looked away, priests held their tongues, and ordinary citizens, buried their fears beneath gossip and distraction. No one wanted to be the first to raise their voice too loudly, for they feared what might happen. Enter those who opposed Alinari. The magistrate who had condemned the theatre had been found dead in the canal. Others remembered his fate too well to risk sharing it. Yet division bled into daily life. Neighbors accused neighbors of complicity. Families argued until they no longer spoke. Lovers quarreled over whether to attend or abstain. Even in markets and gondolas, the question hung in the air. Had you seen the performance? Were you brave enough or weak enough to look away? Venice was no longer bound by its history, its art, or its canals, but by a theatre that forced the city to choose between fascination and fear. And as the city argued, the theatre thrived. Its doors opened each night, its seats filled, and its curtains rose, as though none of the unrest outside existed. The silence of its victims was swallowed by applause, and the cries of those who begged for justice were lost in the canals. Teatro Della Notte did not need to defend itself. Venice defended it, each citizen complicit in silence until the city itself seemed to belong to Alinari's stage. The fifth performance arrived shrouded in rumour. It was said that Alinari himself had written a new script, one more elaborate and dangerous than any before. The title, if it ever existed, was not announced, and the tickets sold for sums so obscene that even seasoned merchants balked. Yet still they were purchased, passed hand to hand until nobles and priests, gamblers and thieves all crowded once more into the blackened belly of Teatro Della Notte. That night, the theatre seemed hungrier than ever. The air was thick and acrid, as though smoke already lingered within its rafters. The audience whispered of omens, candles sputtering out as if smothered by unseen hands, the boards groaning with an echo too deep to belong to wood. Still, none left their seats. The play began with a family trapped in a crumbling house. The set was simple, timbers and walls painted to resemble a dwelling, but the illusion was disturbingly effective. The actors played their parts with a desperation that unsettled the crowd from the first line. Every cough sounded real, every cry ragged with terror, as though they were not pretending, but truly choking on something unseen. Then the fire began. At first it was a suggestion, a flicker of orange light, the crackling sound of resin burned in metal trays. But soon, real flames licked the edges of the stage, climbing higher, spreading faster than reason could explain. The family screamed, their voices shrill and unpolished, and smoke curled above the footlights, stinging the eyes of those in the first rows. The actors stumbled, coughing, clutching one another, their faces slick with sweat. It was no longer possible to believe this was illusion. The fire consumed the set with a speed too furious to be staged. One by one, the performers collapsed, their skin blackened, their clothes aflame. The audience surged to its feet, panic rippling through the hat. Yet when they tried to flee, they found the aisles blocked, not by men but by shadows, tall and unmoving, their faces unseen. The doors would not open, the windows would not shatter. They were trapped, forced to watch. The heat grew unbearable. Several in the balconies swore their hair singed, their gowns smouldered, though no flame touched them. Some clutched their throats, gasping for air, convinced smoke had filled their lungs. And yet, just as the terror reached its peak, the stage fell to black. The flames vanished as suddenly as they had begun. When the light returned, the set stood intact, the boards untouched, no ash, no corpses. The actors were gone. Only silence remained. The curtain fell and rose once more, but there was no cast to bow. The audience stumbled into the night like survivors of a catastrophe, their clothes damp with sweat, their voices hoarse from screaming. Some swore they still smelled smoke in their hair days later, still felt burns upon their skin. Yet even in their horror, they admitted they would return if called. The fire had not been illusion. It had been something worse, an invitation to experience death and walk away. After the fire, the city might have turned away, might have shuttered the theatre for good had the performances not sunk so deeply into the veins of those who had witnessed them. It was no longer only the actors who seemed bound to the scripts. Audience members themselves began to show signs of possession. Nobles who had once laughed over wine now recited lines from the plays in the middle of conversation, their eyes distant, their voices slipping into unfamiliar cadences. Merchants were heard muttering dialogues as they counted their coins, repeating exchanges they could not possibly have memorized. Even priests were caught whispering fragments of scripts in Latin, Greek, or tongues unrecognizable, their faces pale with shame when confronted. At first, these incidents were dismissed as echoes, as people recalling what had unsettled them most. But repetition grew into obsession. Families reported their husbands or wives sitting upright in bed long after midnight, speaking entire passages as though the plays continued inside their minds. Some awoke with bruises on their throats, as if they had been strangled in their sleep. Others scratched lines into their walls with trembling hands, words written backward, as though dictated by something standing behind them. One noblewoman was said to have arranged a dinner, only for her guests to find her pacing her halls, barefoot and weeping, chanting the same line over and over, "The script has no end, the script has no end." Another man, once a respected counsellor, was discovered wandering the streets at dawn, muttering that he had been assigned a role and that he could not escape it. When pressed, he insisted he no longer knew whether he was himself or one of Alinari's characters. Days later, he threw himself into the canal and did not resurface. Even those who denied the theatre's hold confessed to dreams too vivid to ignore. They dreamt of standing upon the stage, the crowd watching in silence, while unseen hands forced lines from their throats. They awoke drenched in sweat, certain they had rehearsed through the night without leaving their beds. Children, too, began to echo words they could not have heard, repeating fragments their parents had brought back unknowingly in their own minds. Families burned their playbills, yet the words remained etched into their memory, impossible to erase. The city grew restless. Conversations shifted from the performances to the sickness they spread. Some called it a plague of the mind, others a curse. But the truth was darker. Teatro Della Notte had expanded its reach beyond its walls. The stage was no longer confined to the building. It had taken root in the thoughts, the dreams, the very language of Venice itself. Alinari's scripts were not plays to be seen and forgotten. They were seeds planted in the mind, growing, consuming, rewriting. And the city, powerless to resist, found itself living out roles it had never chosen. The announcement came without posters, without proclamations, without even the faint scratch of pen upon paper. Yet somehow the entire city knew. A final performance had been called, and it was whispered only as La Ultima Notte, the last night. No tickets were seen in circulation, no advertisements hung upon walls, yet lines of gondolas stretched along the canals days before the theatre opened its doors. It was as if the city itself had been summoned. Families abandoned their businesses, nobles left their estates untended, priests vanished from their pulpits. Every soul who could walk seemed compelled to gather before the theatre, their faces pale with anticipation, their voices hushed as though afraid of breaking a spell. Those who stood in the crowd swore they had not intended to come, that they had risen from their beds with no plan, only to find themselves drifting through the mist, drawn as surely as moths to flame. Neighbours who had sworn never to return found themselves shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the blackened facade. The theatre seemed to breathe that night, its lanterns flaring brighter than before, its doors quivering like the lips of something about to speak. The air was heavy with dread, and yet alive with excitement. Whispers passed through the waiting throng like contagion. Some claimed that this final play would outshine all others, that it would end with a revelation that would change Venice forever. Others insisted that none who entered would leave alive, that the theatre was preparing to claim its greatest offering. Still others whispered that the city itself was the performance, that every person who came would play a role written centuries before. no matter the speculation. No one turned away. When at last the doors opened, the crowd surged forward, pressed not by guards or ushers, but by the weight of their own need. They poured into the theatre, filling every seat, every gallery, every corner of the hall. Some stood packed against the walls, others crouched upon the stairs. The building groaned under their weight, yet no one doubted it would hold. The theatre wanted them there. It had prepared for this night as surely as Alinari had. Witnesses later said the atmosphere inside was unlike any other performance. The silence was absolute, not a cough, not a murmur, not even the rustle of gowns. The audience sat frozen, their eyes wide, their breath shallow, as though the play had already begun before the curtains rose. A priest in the balcony later confessed that he felt invisible hands pressing his shoulders into the seat, forcing him still. Others admitted they could feel their lips moving silently, rehearsing lines they had never learned. Then the lanterns dimmed, plunging the hall into shadow. The velvet curtain stirred, and for the first time, Maestro Vittorio Alinari himself stepped onto the stage. He did not bow. He did not smile. He raised his hands, and the theatre exhaled, a sound like 1,000 sighs at once. The last night had begun. The final performance began without script or title announced, yet every person in the theatre seemed to know their role before a single word was spoken. Alinari stood at the center of the stage, his figure draped in black, his silver hair catching the dim lantern light. When he raised his hand, the actors entered, their faces pale, their eyes glassy, as though emptied of humanity. They did not bow or greet the audience. They simply took their places, forming a circle around the maestro. And then the lines began, not in Italian nor in Latin, but in a tongue none could name, a language that seemed to scrape against the nerves rather than the ear. The words pulsed like a drumbeat, low and unrelenting, vibrating through the boards beneath the audience's feet. At first, the performance resembled a ritual more than a play. The actors spoke in unison, their voices rising and falling like a chant. The audience, transfixed, found themselves mouthing the same words without understanding why. Some tried to resist, to hold their tongues still, but their lips betrayed them. Soon the entire hall had become a chorus, repeating sounds older than memory. The air thickened, the lanterns dimmed, and a suffocating heat filled the space as though fire burned unseen in the rafters. Then the circle broke. One actor screamed, not in character, not in line, but in raw agony. He clawed at his own chest, tearing through his costume, ripping his flesh until his hands were slick with blood. The others followed, convulsing, thrashing, striking one another with fists, with daggers, with their own teeth. Bones cracked, throats gurgled, eyes rolled back as the stage dissolved into carnage. The audience shrieked, but none could flee. The exits had vanished, the doors sealed, and the windows reflected not the canals but the crowd itself, distorted and pale, trapped in an endless mirror. Some spectators collapsed where they sat, their hearts failing under the terror. Others joined the madness, leaping onto the stage to tear at the actors, or at themselves, unable to resist the compulsion that seized them. A nobleman was seen ramming his skull into the balcony rail until bones split. A woman in silks drove her hairpins into her own eyes, laughing as blood streamed down her cheeks. The theatre became one great frenzy, a communion of destruction, the audience indistinguishable from the cast. And above it all, Maestro Alinari stood unmoved. His voice rose above the screams, speaking words that none could translate, but all felt echoing inside their skulls. His eyes burned like coals, his mouth stretched into a smile too wide, and when he spread his arms, the stage boards themselves split open. From the darkness below came a sound that was not human, a chorus of voices, countless and endless, rising to meet him. The lanterns shattered. The curtain fell with a thunderous crash. And then there was silence. When dawn broke over Venice the next morning, the canals were unusually still, the mist hanging low as though reluctant to lift. Neighbors who lived near Teatro Della Notte reported that no audience emerged, no gondolas ferried passengers away, no laughter or chatter carried across the water. The theatre, once alive with the fever of nightly crowds, stood silent. Its lanterns were extinguished, its doors bolted from within, its windows dark as though they had never been lit at all. The silence stretched for hours, until city officials, pressed by families demanding answers, gathered the courage to approach. What they found remains shrouded in contradiction. Some claimed the doors could not be forced, that the wood had hardened into stone. Others swore the locks crumbled at a touch, yet inside there was nothing. No seats, no stage, no trace of performance. Only a cavernous emptiness, as if the theatre had swallowed itself whole. A few officials reported glimpsing stains upon the floor, dark and sticky, though when torches were raised, the boards were spotless. Most unnerving of all, not a single body was recovered. Hundreds had entered that night, and none remained. No corpses, no bones, not even scraps of clothing. It was as if the audience and actors alike had been erased. The council convened in secrecy. They ordered the theatre sealed at once, its doors bricked over, its windows shuttered with iron. The building's name was stricken from records, its existence erased from maps. Those who dared speak of it publicly were silenced, some imprisoned, others found drowned in canals with eyes wide and mouths still open, as if mid-scream. Within weeks, Venice pretended Teatro Della Notte had never reopened at all. Official accounts dismissed the disappearances as rumor, the deaths as invention, the theatre itself as nothing more than superstition. Yet fragments survived. A hand full of playbills carried home in pockets were discovered in trunks years later. Their ink had faded, but the words that remained were not in Italian, nor in any language scholars could recognize. Margins were filled with cryptic diagrams, circles intersected with symbols that defied translation. A few pages of Alinari's script surfaced decades later in Vienna, smuggled from Venice by an unknown hand. Those who examined them confessed to nightmares, to voices whispering lines as they slept, to waking with phrases carved into their skin as though traced by invisible knives. The manuscripts vanished soon after, stolen or destroyed, leaving only rumors of their existence. As for Alinari himself, no trace was found. Some swore they saw him among the crowd that last night, others that he stood upon the stage. A few whispered he had never been a man at all, only the mask through which the theatre spoke. In the end, nothing was confirmed, and perhaps that was the city's intent. For Venice, silence was survival. To acknowledge what had happened would be to admit complicity, and so the city buried the truth beneath layers of denial. Still, the legend endured. It spread quietly through Europe, whispered by travelers, carried in hushed voices across taverns and ports. Teatro della Notte had vanished, but its shadow lingered. And those who dared listen claimed the scripts had not been lost at all, only waiting for another stage. The theatre was sealed, its name erased, its history buried beneath centuries of silence. Yet silence is never enough to kill what was born of blood and shadow. Though Venice pretended Teatro della Notte had never existed, whispers carried across borders, across generations, as persistent as the tide. Sailors spoke of a play performed in Lisbon, where the actors did not rise from the stage. In Paris, a manuscript surfaced, its margins filled with the same strange symbols once glimpsed in Alinari's scripts. In Prague, a scholar claimed he had found fragments of dialogue identical to those whispered by Venetian survivors. Wherever the stories emerged, they were quickly suppressed, the pages burned, the witnesses discredited. But for every tale extinguished, another flickered to life elsewhere. The theatre had not died, it had dispersed. Some insisted that Alinari himself still walked among the living, a silver-haired figure appearing at obscure performances in forgotten halls, always in the shadows, always watching. Others said he was no longer a man, that his voice had been absorbed into the scripts themselves, whispering across centuries, searching for new mouths to speak his lines. And then there were those who believed something even darker, that the audience of that final night had not perished, but had become part of the play, bound eternally within its words, condemned to repeat their deaths again and again wherever the script was read. I should tell you this is only legend, that such stories belong to the dust of archives and the fever of imagination. Yet as I speak, I can't not shake the sense that something listens. The words I have given you tonight, are they mine, or have I only repeated what the script demanded? There are lines that come to me unbidden, phrases I cannot recall writing, yet they appear on the page as though my hand had always known them. At night, I hear echoes, soft voices rehearsing in the dark corners of my room, footsteps pacing as though on wooden boards. Sometimes I think I see the faint glow of footlights, and in their glare faces waiting, watching, eager for the performance to resume. Perhaps you think this distance protects you, that 2 centuries is enough to keep the curse at bay. But the theatre does not care for time. It needs only an audience, and now you have listened. You have pictured the stage, you have imagined the actors, you have followed the words. In doing so, you have become part of the performance. The script survives because it is remembered, because each telling breathes life back into its lines. You, listening now, are as necessary as those who once sat in velvet chairs in 1817. Without you, the play would wither. With you, it continues. So if tonight, after this tale ends, you hear voices rehearsing in the dark, or footsteps on floorboards where no one walks, do not be surprised. The curtain may have fallen on Venice, but the play itself was never finished. Teatro Della Notte still waits, hungry, searching for its next stage, and perhaps, even now, it has found you. If you have stayed with me until the end of this forbidden tale, then you are now part of its audience, and perhaps part of its script. Do not let the story fade into silence. Subscribe to the Macabre record so you do not miss the next account torn from history's darkest corners. And tell me in the comments below, where in the world are you listening from tonight? I want to know how far these whispers have reached.